The two children shouldn't have been there. Everyone in the camp knew that much. But there they stood, barely reaching the giant's belt, speaking in whispers that somehow made the towering man freeze completely still. Malachi Brooks had never stopped his work for anyone. The camp had learned this rule over 3 seasons of watching him trap, trade, and move on without looking back. He was a mountain of a man who made decisions with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring about consequences long ago. Yet the leather pouch in the smaller twins' trembling hands contained something that made the giant's weathered face change entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. Something the camp had only heard about in stories their grandparents whispered when the fire burned low. The girl stepped forward first, her brother close behind, and spoke words that seemed to pull a memory from deep inside the massive trapper's chest. Words that made him kneel down to their height for the first time anyone could remember. But what shocked the camp wasn't the kneeling. It wasn't even the tears that appeared in the giant's eyes. It was what he offered them in return. A trade so impossible that it would force everyone to question everything they thought they knew about the man who had walked among them like a ghost for so long. Because Malachi Brooks had been carrying a secret that would explain why 2 lost children could bring a giant to his knees with nothing more than a whispered name and a leather pouch that contained something from a world he thought he'd left buried forever. The children had walked 3 days without proper food. Koda's moccasins were worn through at the heels, and his sister Tala carried their only possession clutched against her chest like it contained her beating heart. The trading camp sprawled before them in the valley, smoke rising from cook fires, and the sound of men haggling over pelts and supplies filling the morning air. They had heard about the giant from travelers who passed through their settlement before the sickness took everyone. Malachi Brooks, they said, traded fairly but never showed mercy to those who crossed him. He stood nearly 7 feet tall and could lift a full-grown elk across his shoulders without strain. More importantly, he had connections that reached far beyond this remote camp, connections that could get 2 lost children to safety. Tala touched the leather pouch again, feeling the weight of the carved bone piece inside. Their grandmother had pressed it into her hands with trembling fingers before the fever claimed her, whispering instructions that seemed impossible to follow. "Find the giant man with the scar across his left hand," she had said. "Show him this piece, speak the name she taught them, and he would understand what needed to be done." The campmen noticed them immediately. 2 native children alone meant trouble or opportunity, depending on the man doing the looking. A bearded trader called out suggestions about putting them to work hauling water, while another suggested they might fetch a decent price from the right buyer. The children kept walking, ignoring the crude laughter and pointed fingers. Malachi stood beside a wagon loaded with beaver pelts, checking the quality of each hide with practiced hands. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the warm day, and his dark hair was pulled back with a leather cord. The scar their grandmother had described ran from his wrist to his knuckles, a pale line against his weathered skin. Koda stepped forward first, his small voice barely carrying over the camp noise. Tala joined him, and together they spoke the name their grandmother had made them memorize, syllable by syllable, until they could say it without thinking. The change in Malachi was immediate and terrible. His hands stopped moving and the pelt he was holding dropped to the ground. His face went completely white, as if someone had struck him across the chest with a club. The camp grew quieter as men sensed something significant happening, though none of them understood what. Tala opened the leather pouch and held up the carved bone piece. It was no larger than her thumb, yellowed with age, and marked with symbols that meant nothing to anyone except the man staring at it like he was seeing a ghost. Because in that moment, Malachi Brooks realized that the past he had spent 15 years trying to forget had just walked into his camp in the form of 2 hungry children who carried proof of everything he had lost. Malachi's knees hit the ground so hard that dust rose around him. The sound echoed across the camp like a gunshot, and every conversation stopped. Men who had been arguing over prices turned to stare at the giant who had never shown weakness to anyone, now kneeling before 2 children who barely reached his waist. Tala held the bone carving closer to his face, and Malachi's massive hand shook as he reached toward it. The symbols etched into the surface were crude but unmistakable to someone who had once known their meaning. A circular pattern with 7 lines extending outward, the mark of a family he had believed was extinct. The camp boss, a stocky man named Coleman, pushed through the crowd of gathering traders. He had seen Malachi dismiss grieving widows and ignore starving families without blinking, and this sudden display of emotion made him nervous. Weakness in one trader could affect the whole camp's reputation. "Brooks, what's this about?" Coleman demanded. "These children got business here or not?" Malachi didn't answer. His attention was locked on Coda, who had begun speaking in the native language their grandmother had taught them. The words were formal, ceremonial, the kind used for important agreements between tribes. He was explaining their situation with the careful precision of someone much older, describing the sickness that had taken their people and their desperate journey to find the one man who might honor an old debt. The camp had fallen completely silent. Even the men who understood some native languages struggled to follow Coda's formal speech. But Malachi understood every word. More than that, he understood the obligation those words carried. The bone carving wasn't just a family marker. It was a promise token, the kind exchanged between allies to guarantee future protection for each other's children. Tala stepped closer and placed her small hand against Malachi's scarred palm. The touch seemed to break something loose inside the giant's chest, and tears began running down his weathered cheeks. The camp had never seen him cry. They had barely seen him smile. "We offer ourselves for your protection," Tala said in English, her voice carrying clearly across the silent camp. "We will work for you, serve your household, carry your burdens. In exchange, you give us shelter and safety until we are grown enough to make our own way." Coleman laughed harshly. "Hell, Brooks. Just take them if you want them. No need for ceremony about it." But Malachi was shaking his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that made his words barely recognizable. "You don't understand," he said to the gathered men. "These children aren't asking for charity. They're calling in a blood debt I thought I'd never have to pay." He stood slowly, his full height casting a shadow over both twins, and made an announcement that would change everything the camp thought they knew about the quiet giant who had lived among them for 3 years, without ever speaking about his past. Malachi looked around the circle of men watching him, their faces showing confusion and growing suspicion. He had lived among them for 3 years, sharing their fires and trading alongside them, but he had never told them about the time before, about the family that had saved his life when he was barely older than these children, wounded and dying in a winter that should have killed him. 15 years ago, I was hunting alone up north, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent camp. Got caught in a blizzard that lasted 8 days. When it finally broke, I was more dead than alive, frozen so bad I couldn't feel my hands or feet. That's when her people found me. Tala clutched the bone carving tighter, and Malachi nodded toward her. Her grandmother, White Dove, she took me into their lodge, fed me, warmed me, nursed me back to health over 2 months. Her family shared their food through the hardest part of winter, even though they had barely enough for themselves. Coleman spat into the dirt. "So you owe them for some hospitality. That don't mean you got to take on their orphans." "It means more than hospitality," Malachi said, his voice getting harder. "When I was strong enough to leave, White Dove's husband, Standing Bear, made me a brother, gave me this." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a band of scars around his forearm. Marks that looked like they had been cut deliberately into his skin. "These marks mean I swore to protect their bloodline, their children, their children's children, anyone who carries their family sign and speaks the sacred words." The camp stirred uneasily. Blood oaths were serious business in any culture. And the scars on Malachi's arm looked old and deep. Coda stepped forward and spoke again in his careful native language, explaining something that made Malachi's jaw tighten with determination. "The boy says their grandmother told them I would honor the old agreement," Malachi translated, "that I would take them as my own family and protect them until they're grown. She said I would remember my debt." Coleman laughed, but it sounded forced. "Hell, Brooks, that was 15 years ago. Things change. Nobody expects you to honor some old promise to people who are probably all dead anyway." "They are all dead," Tala said quietly, speaking directly to Coleman for the first time. "The fever took everyone. Grandmother lived long enough to tell us about the giant with the scarred hand who owed our family a life debt. She said he would keep his word because he was a man of honor." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and every man in the camp understood what she was really saying. Malachi Brooks could either prove he was the honorable man these children believed him to be, or he could show everyone that his word meant nothing when it became inconvenient. But what none of them expected was the price Malachi was about to name for honoring that promise, a cost that would force him to reveal the most carefully guarded secret of his entire life. Malachi walked to his wagon and pulled out a wooden chest that the camp had seen him guard carefully for 3 years. He had never opened it in front of anyone, always waiting until he was alone in his tent to examine whatever treasures he kept inside. The men gathered closer, curiosity overcoming their usual respect for each other's privacy. The chest was locked with a complex mechanism that required Malachi to press several hidden points in sequence. When it finally opened, the camp caught glimpses of rolled papers, small leather bags, and what appeared to be official documents bearing government seals. But Malachi ignored all of those items and reached for something wrapped in soft deerskin at the very bottom. When he unwrapped it, several men gasped. It was a photograph, carefully preserved and mounted in a silver frame. The image showed a younger Malachi standing beside a woman in a white dress, both of them smiling at the camera. Behind them stood a large house with painted shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of home that required significant wealth to build and maintain. "My name isn't Malachi Brooks," he said, holding the photograph so the children could see it. "It's Malcolm Brookshire. I own the largest cattle ranch in 3 territories, and that woman was my wife, Catherine." The camp erupted in shocked murmurs. Malcolm Brookshire was a name every trader and rancher knew, a man whose wealth was legendary throughout the region. Stories said he had disappeared years ago after some kind of family tragedy, leaving his vast holdings to be managed by business partners. Coleman's face had gone pale. "You're telling us you're Malcolm Brookshire? The cattle baron? Why the hell are you living like a trapper if you own half the territory?" Malcolm looked at the photograph for a long moment before answering. "Because Catherine died giving birth to our son, and the boy died 3 days later. I couldn't stand to be in that house, surrounded by everything we had planned for a family that was never going to come home. So I left everything behind and became someone else." Tala stepped closer to study the photograph, and when she looked up at Malcolm, her eyes were bright with understanding. "You lost your children, so now you can become father to children who lost their family." The simple truth of her words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He had spent 15 years running from the pain of his loss, living as a different man in places where no one knew his real name or his real story. But these children weren't asking him to forget his grief. They were asking him to transform it into something that could save them both. "The trade I'm offering," Malcolm said to the assembled camp, "is that I will take these children home to my ranch and raise them as my own heirs. But that means revealing who I really am, which means the life I've built here ends forever." What the camp didn't know was that going home meant facing the one person who had been searching for Malcolm Brookshire for 15 years. Someone who would never forgive him for abandoning his responsibilities and disappearing without explanation. The silence stretched across the camp like a held breath. Every man present was recalculating everything they thought they knew about the quiet trapper who had lived among them. Malcolm Brookshire's disappearance had been the subject of speculation for years throughout the territories. Some said he had been murdered by business rivals. Others claimed he had gone insane with grief and wandered into the wilderness to die. Coleman was the first to find his voice. "If you're really Brookshire, then you've got responsibilities. People depending on you. You can't just play house with a couple of Indian kids." Malcolm carefully placed the photograph back in its wrapping. "Those responsibilities are exactly why I left. I built that ranch to be a legacy for my children. When they died, everything I had worked for felt meaningless. But maybe this is why I survived that winter 15 years ago. Maybe White Dove's family saved me so I could save these children." Coda stepped forward and touched Malcolm's scarred hand, tracing the old marks with his small finger. "Our grandmother said you would understand loss. She said you had the same empty eyes as our mother after father died in the hunting accident." The observation cut deep, because it was accurate. Malcolm remembered catching his reflection in windows during his last months at the ranch, seeing the hollow look that grief had carved into his face. He had tried to fill that emptiness with work, with anger, with distance, but nothing had worked until this moment. "The children need more than I can give them here," Malcolm said, addressing the entire camp. "They need education, medical care, a chance at a real future. My ranch can provide all of that." But Coleman wasn't finished. "And what about your brother? Benjamin Brookshire's been running your operation for 15 years, waiting for you to come back or be declared legally dead. You think he's going to welcome you home with open arms, especially when you show up claiming these kids as your heirs?" The mention of Benjamin's name made Malcolm's face darken. The brothers had parted on bitter terms, with Benjamin arguing that Malcolm was abandoning his duties to the ranch and the hundreds of families who depended on Brookshire cattle for their livelihoods. The final argument had been brutal, with words spoken that couldn't easily be forgiven. Tala looked up at Malcolm with concern. Is your brother a bad man? Will he hurt us? Malcolm knelt down to meet her eyes. Benjamin isn't bad, but he's angry. He's been carrying the weight of my responsibilities for 15 years, and he believes I abandoned him when he needed me most. He might see you as a threat to everything he's built in my absence. The honesty in Malcolm's voice made the children exchange worried glances. They had been prepared for the challenges of convincing one man to honor an old debt, but they hadn't considered that returning to his real life might put them in danger from his own family. But what none of them knew was that Benjamin Brookshire had been doing more than just managing the ranch. He had been systematically preparing to have his missing brother declared legally dead, a process that would make him the sole owner of the Brookshire Empire and everything that came with it. Malcolm spent the rest of the day preparing for a journey he had sworn never to make. He traded his trapping supplies for travel provisions, bought proper clothes for the children, and wrote letters to contacts who could help spread word of his return. Every action felt like stepping back into a skin he had shed years ago, uncomfortable but strangely familiar. The children helped him pack, their small hands careful with his possessions. Tala had wrapped the bone carving in a piece of cloth and tucked it safely into her new travel bag, while Coda practiced saying Malcolm instead of the formal address their grandmother had taught them. They were adapting quickly, but Malcolm could see the worry in their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. Coleman approached as the sun began to set, carrying a folded newspaper that looked several weeks old. Found this in my supplies. Thought you might want to see it before you head home. The headline made Malcolm's blood run cold. Brookshire Ranch expansion continues under new management. The article described how Benjamin had negotiated major contracts with Eastern buyers, expanded the cattle operation into new territories, and modernized the ranch buildings. But the final paragraph was what made Malcolm's hands shake. Benjamin Brookshire announced his intention to file for legal declaration of death for his missing brother Malcolm, citing the need for clear ownership during continued business expansion. The filing is expected to be approved within 60 days, making Benjamin the sole proprietor of the Brookshire cattle empire. Coda looked up from packing a saddlebag. What does the paper say? You look like you've seen a ghost. Malcolm folded the newspaper carefully. It says my brother has been planning to take over everything I own. If I don't get back soon, I won't legally exist anymore, and he'll have complete control of the ranch. The implications were staggering. If Benjamin succeeded in having Malcolm declared dead, any children Malcolm tried to claim as heirs would have no legal standing. The ranch, the cattle, the vast holdings that could provide security for Coda and Tala would all belong to Benjamin, who had no obligation to honor promises made by his supposedly dead brother. Tala set down the bag she was packing and walked over to Malcolm. Then we have to get there before the 60 days are finished. How long is the journey? 3 weeks if we push hard and don't run into trouble, Malcolm said. But there's something else. Benjamin isn't just taking over the business. He's planning to remarry, and his new wife will expect to be the lady of the house. She won't welcome competition for Benjamin's attention or resources. The children had lost their family once to disease. Now they were facing the possibility of losing their new protector to legal maneuvering and family politics they barely understood. But Malcolm was beginning to realize that the bone carving and the old debt were just the beginning of their connection. These children needed him, but he was starting to understand that he needed them just as much. As they prepared to leave the camp at dawn, none of them knew that Benjamin had already received word of Malcolm's presence at the trading post, and that he was making preparations of his own to ensure his missing brother's return would be far from welcome. The Brookshire Ranch stretched across the valley like a small town, with the main house sitting on a hill overlooking hundreds of cattle and dozens of smaller buildings. Malcolm had forgotten how impressive his empire looked from a distance. All white-painted fences and red-roofed barns arranged with the precision of a man who valued order above all else. Benjamin's influence was visible everywhere, from the new bunkhouses to the expanded corrals that hadn't existed when Malcolm left. Coda and Tala rode quietly beside him, taking in their first sight of what Malcolm had described as their new home. The children had grown comfortable with him during the 3-week journey, but now their nervousness was obvious. They understood that everything depended on the next few hours. There are so many people, Tala whispered, watching ranch hands moving between the buildings. Do they all work for you? They work for Benjamin now, Malcolm corrected. Whether they'll work for me again depends on how this conversation goes. A rider approached them at full gallop, dust rising behind his horse. Malcolm recognized him as Tom Fletcher, the ranch foreman who had been loyal to the Brookshire family for over 20 years. Tom's face showed shock, relief, and something that might have been fear all mixed together. "Malcolm, Jesus Christ, is it really you?" Tom reined in his horse hard, the animal dancing sideways. "Benjamin's been expecting you. Word came 3 days ago that you were traveling this way." "How is he?" Malcolm asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Angry doesn't begin to cover it," Tom said honestly. "He's got lawyers here from the territorial capital. The wedding's planned for next month, and he's been telling everyone you're probably an imposter trying to claim the inheritance. Says the real Malcolm Brookshire died years ago." The children exchanged worried glances. They had traveled hundreds of miles based on the promise that Malcolm would protect them, but now it seemed he might not even be able to protect himself. "What about the legal declaration?" Malcolm asked. "Filed 2 weeks ago. Judge approved it yesterday morning, pending any evidence that you're still alive. Benjamin owns everything now, legal and proper." The words hit Malcolm like a physical blow. He was too late. According to territorial law, he no longer existed, which meant he had no legal right to claim the children as his heirs or provide them with the security he had promised. But Tala surprised them all by sliding down from her horse and walking directly toward the main house. "Then we don't talk to lawyers," she called back to Malcolm. "We talk to your brother as family the way grandmother taught us. Sometimes the heart understands things the law cannot." What she didn't know was that Benjamin Brookshire had spent 15 years hardening his heart against any possibility of his brother's return, and that he had already made arrangements to ensure that Malcolm's reappearance would destroy him completely. Benjamin Brookshire stood on the front porch of the house their father had built, flanked by 2 territorial lawyers and a woman in an expensive dress who could only be his intended bride. He was older than Malcolm remembered, graying at the temples and carrying the weight of 15 years of responsibility in his shoulders, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made him Malcolm's closest advisor before grief tore them apart. "So the prodigal brother returns," Benjamin said as Malcolm approached with the children. "Convenient timing, just days after the legal declaration was approved." Malcolm stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping his voice level. "I'm not here to challenge what you've built, Benjamin. I'm here to honor a debt and provide for these children. Children who conveniently appear to legitimize your claim to an inheritance you abandoned." Benjamin's voice was cold, practiced. "How much are you paying them to play this role?" Tala stepped forward before Malcolm could respond, her small voice carrying clearly across the yard. "My name is Tala Standing Bear, daughter of Joseph Standing Bear, granddaughter of White Dove who saved your brother's life in the winter of the deep snows. I carry the bone token of our family bond and speak the sacred words of the protection promise." She held up the carved bone piece, and something in her formal tone made Benjamin pause. This wasn't the rehearsed speech of a coached child. This was the careful recitation of someone who had been taught sacred traditions. "Show him the photograph," Coda said quietly to Malcolm. Malcolm pulled out the silver-framed picture of himself and Catherine. Benjamin's face went white when he saw it, because he recognized not just the image but the frame itself. It had sat on Malcolm's desk for years, and Benjamin had searched everywhere for it after his brother's disappearance, never knowing Malcolm had taken it with him. "You kept it," Benjamin whispered, his careful composure finally cracking. "All these years, you kept her picture." "I kept everything that mattered," Malcolm said, "including my promise to the family that saved my life. These children need what this ranch can provide, and I need to stop running from the man I was supposed to be." The lawyers started to object, citing legal precedents and inheritance laws, but Benjamin raised his hand for silence. He walked down the steps and knelt in front of Tala, studying the bone carving with the attention it deserved. "This is real," he said finally. "I remember the stories Malcolm told about the native family who helped him. The details match perfectly. The law says I'm dead," Malcolm pointed out, "but the law can be changed if the family agrees to petition for reversal of the death declaration." Benjamin stood slowly, looking between his brother and the children who had traveled so far to claim protection. "The ranch is profitable enough to support 2 families. There's room for everyone, including these children. But I have conditions." "Name them," Malcolm said. "You don't get to disappear again. No more running when things get difficult. You help me run this operation properly, as partners the way we should have been 15 years ago." Malcolm nodded. "Agreed." Benjamin turned to his lawyers. "File the petition to reverse the death declaration. Malcolm Brookshire is alive, and these children are now his legal heirs with full rights to inheritance. 3 months later, Koda and Tala were enrolled in the territorial school, learning to read and write in English while teaching their new family the native languages their grandmother had passed down. Malcolm had taken over the ranch's expansion into new territories, while Benjamin managed the day-to-day operations. The brothers worked together with the efficiency of men who had finally forgiven each other for the wounds of the past. Tala kept the bone carving in a place of honor in her room, a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage comes from the smallest voices, and that honoring old debts can create new families stronger than blood itself. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.